The United States and Russia have begun a new nuclear arms race. After Trump's statement that the United States is resuming nuclear tests, Vladimir Putin announced that Russia is preparing for nuclear tests on Novaya Zemlya. He also called an emergency meeting of the Russian Federation Security Council about this. But the statement by United States President Donald Trump last week that the United States would resume nuclear weapons testing on equal terms with Russia and China caught both his own officials and Beijing and Moscow by surprise. Resuming warhead tests would break the 30-year moratorium that the world's major nuclear powers have observed. But in the United States, they admit that Trump was provoked to take this step by Putin's boasting about two new weapons delivery systems, Burevestnik and Poseidon. In addition, Russia had been secretly modernizing its nuclear facilities for a year, and the United States couldn't help but notice. The world once again entered a nuclear standoff, but an interesting point emerges. The fact is that, according to data from many scientists, America doesn't necessarily need to conduct nuclear tests in order to test nuclear weapons. In this episode, I'll explain what is meant by that. And that's why if Trump says that the United States is resuming actual nuclear tests, and he means what he's saying, it means that America is simply starting to bring its nuclear forces to a completely new level. Because today there are already several methods for conducting nuclear tests without an actual nuclear explosion. That's why it's not worth announcing. But I suggest we analyze the main prerequisites for such a confrontation and discuss how all of this could actually end. My name is Pechiy. Let's discuss this topic together. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, give it a like, and write any detailed comment under this video. Also, subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pechiy News. The link to it is in the description of this video. There we publish breaking news as soon as it comes in. If you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, you can do so with any donation or a paid sponsorship subscription. You can do this using the links and details in the description of this video. It says there, support the Pechiy channel. Pick any format that works for you. I appreciate any support you offer. So, Donald Trump's statements about resuming nuclear tests were probably a response to Putin's announcement about testing two nuclear systems, the long-range cruise missile Burevestnik and the unmanned underwater vehicle Poseidon. The Russian dictator claimed that these systems can bypass existing missile defense systems. Thus, as you understand, he was criticizing Donald Trump's plan to expand the modern United States missile defense system into a complex system called the Iron Dome. In doing so, he was personally targeting Donald Trump and mocking his system. Perhaps Trump intended to make it clear that the United States would increase testing of delivery systems, not the warheads themselves. However, in a television interview that aired over the weekend, he seemed to confirm that he was indeed referring to explosive nuclear tests. But then United States Secretary of Energy Chris Wright stated that the United States would simply continue testing systems using non-nuclear explosions. But whatever the truth may be, a return to United States warhead testing would be a very regressive step. It would give a reason for similar actions, not only by Russia and China, but also by other nuclear states that are seeking to modernize their weapons. It could encourage a non-nuclear state to develop its own nuclear weapons. It would also destroy one of the few remaining pillars of arms control between the United States and Russia. The agreement that limited missile defense systems created to maintain mutual deterrence and the intermediate range missiles have already lost their force. Now the final deterrent is collapsing before us. The treaty called New Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, which limits the number of deployed strategic warheads to 1,550 on each side, is set to expire in February of next year, 2026. Putin proposed a conditional one-year extension. Washington expressed approval, but officially we see no extension. The statement about the treaty and the statement about nuclear tests, these statements about resuming tests look especially alarming. Against the backdrop of Russia's war against Ukraine bringing back the practice of nuclear blackmail, Putin has been using nuclear blackmail from the very beginning to deter NATO countries from direct intervention and from supplying Ukraine with powerful weapons. It is also alarming that American intelligence assessed it as 50-50. The likelihood Moscow would use nuclear weapons when Russian troops faced defeat in Ukraine in late 2022. Meanwhile, the long-standing strategic balance between the two nuclear superpowers has also been threatened by the rise of China as a nuclear power. According to Pentagon estimates, Beijing's arsenal could increase from about 600 warheads to more than 1,000 by 2030. And Trump insists that China must join future arms control agreements. But there's a problem. Even if China joins and the numbers in the treaty remain unchanged, 1,550 warheads per country, it turns out that the combined arsenal of Russia and China could soon exceed that of the United States. Meanwhile, Beijing generally refuses to participate in such negotiations, claiming that it has significantly fewer nuclear weapons. And on this issue, some Western experts insist that Trump was almost supposed to give in to Putin. By no means should he go for such a confrontation. Are you kidding? Let me give you a quote from the Financial Times. Regardless of Trump's justified disappointment in Putin in his efforts to end the war in Ukraine, and regardless of China's position, today the United States President must cooperate with Moscow to extend the current New Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty as a step toward restoring arms control. He previously called this a priority. Achieving decisive progress in this direction would be a much better way to earn the Nobel Peace Prize, which he desires so much, than ending the long-standing taboo on nuclear weapons testing. Well, here I would like to remind the editors of the Financial Times that Russia itself has long provoked the United States into taking the very step that Donald Trump announced. Donald Trump's administration back in 2020 discussed resuming underground nuclear tests over possible moratorium violations by Russia and China. At that time, it was about Russia and China possibly conducting underground nuclear tests, but using a charge of less than 1 kiloton. If such a charge is detonated underground, the International Monitoring System for Nuclear Explosions might simply not detect this test. They say the yield is too small, and with such yields, tests can actually be conducted. At the time, Trump's team claimed they had evidence that Russia and China were doing exactly that. In addition, several times in recent years, Russia has announced and simulated preparations to resume nuclear testing at the polar test site on Novaya Zemlya. Let me remind you how Shoigu's plane flew around that test site. The Russians put on quite a show, demonstrating that they were about to start testing nuclear weapons. Russia mentioned alleged United States nuclear test preparations. Donald Trump is now publicly calling for the United States to resume nuclear testing in response to China and Russia's violations. But I would say that to some extent Donald Trump's statement is a political message to Putin and Xi Jinping. Why political? Yes, because the American military has long been conducting nuclear tests in a completely different way, and they don't need a nuclear explosion for that. At the deep facilities of the Nevada test site, they conduct subcritical experiments with plutonium-V. In such experiments, explosives compress a sample of nuclear material, but its quantity and shape are chosen so that a self-sustaining nuclear reaction does not start. That is, there is actually no explosion. They only measure how the material behaves under pressure and at temperatures close to combat conditions. At special facilities of the Los Alamos National Laboratory, 2 powerful X-ray stations record on a microsecond scale how the impulse of a nuclear charge ablation occurs without the release of nuclear energy. A high-powered laser is used at the Livermore National Laboratory to study thermonuclear fusion. And all this collected data is processed by a supercomputer system, where physical processes are modeled at the level of individual atoms with microsecond-level detail. And now, at this point, the United States can do without testing even for a significant portion of the range of munitions, including thermonuclear ones. There's no need to announce a return to nuclear testing since they can already do them without an actual explosion. And this is where Putin and Xi Jinping should be very concerned and cautious. After all, if Donald Trump really meant what he said about nuclear testing, it could mean that the United States lacks the existing technologies I mentioned for certain tasks, specifically for creating a radically new line of nuclear products. It's just that supercomputers are no longer enough, and that's why it turned out that actual physical nuclear tests are needed. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to leave a like. That's all for now. Take care. Goodbye.